Dr. Janelle Belmas, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit today about news judgment. News judgment is going to be broken into two parts. The first one that we're going to focus on now is some characteristics of news and sort of some definitional stuff that you might need when you're out in the field working. I'd like to start out with the old adage. When dog bites a man, it's not really news, right? Because that happens all the time. But if a man bites a dog, that's news, okay? Now I'm going to take that apart a little bit for you. There may be a time when a dog biting a man is news, particularly maybe if it's a dog biting a president or a mayor or a senator or somebody else important, maybe Paris Hilton. And there might be a time when a man biting a dog isn't news, like if the man has bitten a dog 50 times before, or if there are a bunch of men biting dogs. There's a whole bunch of things that go into the idea of news judgment. If news judgment is confusing to you, you're not alone. You will not be the only person who will have struggled with it, and it certainly will come to you over time. Let's talk a little bit about some definitions of news judgment. The simplest definition of news judgment is the ability to determine which stories are most interesting and most important to readers. And we're thinking about your readers and stories that are critical or important to them. Okay? An editor is going to decide where stories run and where they will run, either in the broadcast, online, or in a newspaper. But it is up to reporters and writers to find stories that compete for that prime space, whether that's first in the newscast, front page above the fold in the paper, or first on the website. Now again, if you're confused by this, don't worry, it'll become a little bit clearer as we go on. Let's talk a little bit about the people who will be consuming the news. We know a few things from studies about consumers of news. First of all, and you know this from your own life, they're in a hurry. Everybody wants the information quickly, efficiently, effectively, and accurately, and they don't want to spend a whole lot of time doing it. Often they've got really short attention spans. Why do you think Twitter is only 140 characters? 140 characters is a short attention span. It's very quick. People don't want to spend a lot of time. They want their information now. But more importantly, they want stories that connect in some way to them, their lives, their families, their experiences, something that resonates within them. All right? They want stories that are told in a compelling way. They want to be interested in the stories. They want stories to grab them, to hold them beyond the first paragraph. But there is more than one type of reader. Right? So there are readers who are going to be willing to spend more time on a story. We need to be able to catch those people too. There are people who want just the facts. There are people who want background. You need to be able to bring them information in some way that catches them and holds them. Okay? So news consumers are people out there. Sometimes you know who they are, but often you don't. You want to be able to satisfy as many of them in as close a time as possible. All right, I'm going to turn next to some old ideas about news. It used to be that news was all about the money. A 1938 reporting manual says, news is an account of an event by which a newspaper prints in the belief that by doing so, it will profit. All about the money. If you ask most reporters now, yeah, they're concerned about profit, but they're more concerned about news that matters. Okay? There are plenty of people who blog or create news just for the joy of it, okay, for the heck of it. They are less worried about the profit motive than they are about connecting with readers. I'm not going to pretend that your news organization or your media organization doesn't care about the bottom line. Of course they do. There are a whole lot of tools out there that your accounting people will be looking for to make sure that you're connecting with readers in a way that will profit. But it is not the only vision, and it certainly is somewhat of an aged vision. Let's talk a little bit about news today. News does have to be factual, but some students will run into the conundrum that everything that's fact is news, and that's not true. Okay, that is not true. Not all facts are news. Okay, there are going to be facts out there that simply are not news, that are background or that are simply information. News can be opinion, all right, but if it's an important enough opinion for an important enough person to have, that's when it's going to be news. It's not necessarily going to be your opinion. I've many, many times read stories by reporters who inject their opinion too much, and frankly, that's verboten. All right, you need not to do that. If you're going to have opinion, it's got to be about somebody whose opinion matters. Not to say that yours doesn't, but it'll matter in another class more than here. News is about people. What people do, what people say, and the impact they have. News has to touch people. It's about people doing things that have impact on other people. Your community is also important. What's important in our community here in Fullerton may not be important in Sacramento or in the Midwest or in Washington, D.C. But What's important here is what our readers are going to grab onto. It's going to be gravitating toward them. And finally, they call it news for a reason. What's news today may not be news tomorrow. Okay? So these are some general ideas to keep in mind as we turn to some of the more basic definitions in helping you develop your own news judgment. There are many, many, many different definitions. I'm going to give you one. Your instructor may key on some different words, but the elements are going to be the same. Does news change with the times? Some people say it does. Some people say that the 24/7, 365 news cycle, the news cycle that makes you be on the news every moment of every day, has created a different idea. I'm going to teach you something that I think you'll be able to carry with you despite the times, and that is the CRIT formula. Consequential, relevant, interesting, and timely. Okay? Let's break that down. Starting out with consequence, you might see it as prominence, impact, or importance. That is really going to be critical. How much and how will the information that I want to report affect my audience? It's critical, because if you don't catch them with consequence, you're going to have lost them. All right? How relevant is it to them? How close is it? Proximity is another term you might see for this. How close is it to my life? All right? My folks live in Wisconsin. Things that happen in Wisconsin are more important to them than things that happen in California, and vice versa. Closeness and proximity is relevant. Okay? Interest. Is it unique in some way? Is it compelling or surprising? Is it something that your readers want to know? And finally, is it timely? New enough to have an impact. Okay? So the CRIT analysis, again, is one way of thinking about developing your own news judgment. Consequence, relevance, interest, and timeliness. All right, now that we've talked about some basics, I want to talk about some other things that might become part of your newsworthiness judgment or your news judgment. First, conflict. People love conflict. They love the idea of people fighting with each other. That's why sports is so popular, because it's inherent conflict, right? They want to know about who wins, who loses, but be careful not to fall into the horse race type of reporting where all you care about is who wins and loses. There's a whole lot of information behind conflict that needs to be put into context. Other interests, disaster, Hurricane Katrina. Here, I used a tornado, which we don't really get so much here, but certainly in the Midwest, tornadoes are big news. They destroy things. Earthquakes, anything that fires, anything that is a natural or human-made disaster is something that is going to be important and relevant to your readers or your viewers. Okay? Finally, money. Talking about money is an important element. There was a big LA Times story where the reporters found out that the city of Bell's managers were making hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's important. That was particularly important to the people in Bell, but it also had more broad appeal because other communities started wondering what their community leaders were making. Progress. How is the building of the building progressing? How is the building of the bridge progressing? How is our budget negotiations going? Anything that reports some sort of progress might also be newsworthy. And lastly is something odd or weird. Is something strange, like the idea of a man biting a dog. That might be something that draws you in. All of these factors have potential to influence the CRIT elements, whether or not they bring it closer, more important, or more timely. Let's talk a little bit about the difference between hard and soft news. I'm not going to make a judgment here. There's going to be a lot of people who are going to say soft news is just fluff. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Let's think, though, a little bit about the difference. Hard news is just the facts, ma'am, kinds of stories. Stories that are tied to an event, that are tied to official business, government, politics, wars, foreign affairs, education, etc. Something that is really tied to informing the public about information it needs to know to be a self-governing democracy. On the other hand, we have what some people will call soft news, maybe feature. Background, historical information, stuff that advises you, profiles on people, stuff that is interesting to humans as humans, that are appealing to the emotions of people rather than their intellectual capacities. And the primary goal, some people would say, to entertain. Now, I've made a distinction here that might be too false of a distinction. Certainly there are soft news elements in hard news, and there are hard news elements in soft news. But when your professor is talking about hard news, he or she is probably referring to the kind of news that means to inform primarily rather than to entertain. All right, let's talk about some other features of news. News has to be accurate. Okay? I cannot stress that enough. News has to be accurate. You got to spell the names right. You got to get the addresses right. You have to get the details right. Once you start losing your audience on factual errors, you lose your audience for good. So I cannot stress enough how important accuracy is. That's why your instructor may well ask you to provide contact information for the people that you interview so they can double check the accuracy of the information and the spellings of names. We'll talk more about that in a later module as well, about verification and validation. News also has to be balanced, right? You're not writing opinion pieces here. You're reporting a balanced perspective on an issue that is important to people in the community. Don't overemphasize, don't underemphasize. Again, this comes with practice. Establishing a proper relationship between the sources and the information and the sides, if you will, of the stories is really an important factor to consider. And they need to be objective, impartial, all right? In other words, your opinion certainly does count, but when you're writing a news story, inserting things like, and by the way, I think the mayor lied, is probably not the best idea, all right? Certainly you can work with your editorial staff to write an editorial on that line, along those lines, but you should not in a news story be biased. All right. Let's talk about a few issues here, a few ideas here of what might be newsworthy and what is not newsworthy. We'll start with an easy one. The U.S. President signs a bill that overhauls Medicare and Social Security. Newsworthy or not? Come on, this one is easy. You bet it is, right? Crit is met. Okay, it's timely, it's important, it's relevant. All right? All important stuff. How do you play it? If you're writing or reporting for a local newspaper or a local news organization, you probably want to find some local sources that will talk about this. Or you may not want to play it necessarily on page 1 above the fold. You certainly have that discretion. Okay? But is it news? You bet it's news. Okay? It is clearly newsworthy. It's an important person talking about something that's relevant to a lot of people. Let's do another example. Newsworthy or not? 2 of your friends buy new smartphones. This is pretty easy too. Sure, it's important to them. Absolutely, it's important to them. They have a cool new gadget they get to play with. But how about to the rest of us? I didn't get a new phone. Why do I care? Now, that's not to say that you can't do a story on the use or acquisition of smartphones. How can you do this? Well, you can talk to a bunch of people, all right? Or you can find a hook somehow. Maybe your friends bought smartphones because your professors are delivering content online, for example, all right? If that's the case, that might be a news story that would be worth running, all right? But as it is, 2 of your friends buying new smartphones, yeah, not news. You've got to work to make it news, okay? Now let's get just a little bit tougher. Newsworthy or not, campus security announced that they will support gun training for all faculty in the future. Don't worry, I'm not loading up, all right? Is this news or not? Well, kind of, okay? You've got some of the other stuff. You've got, relevance, you've got importance, but is it really timely? What's the future? Can you nail somebody down? Is it 10 years, 5 years, 20 years, 50 years, next week? All right? It's important, yes. Is it worth something? Maybe a soft news story, something featurey, background information, something like that? Sure, maybe. But is it really hard news worthy of playing above the fold? Yeah, I don't know. You've got to find some sort of hook, and you've got to clarify with them about what is the future and what will this actually mean for faculty and students on campus. Now, if you're feeling compelled or overwhelmed or confused, don't stress it, all right? Your news sense is probably not going to be fully developed right now. Mine isn't, and I've been doing this for a long time, all right? It's a process. The more you see, the more you read, the more you can test it against your own senses of what is news and what is not news, okay? Go ahead and take a look. Many, many times I'll turn to my husband and say, that's not news. Why is that in the newspaper, right? You will develop your own sense of what is newsworthy to you, your community, your family, your relationships, right? And just because someone else chose to publish it doesn't mean that it is really news or that you would have to publish it. It's really about developing your own sense of your own community and your own readers or consumers as to what is going to be important and as to what actually going to be newsworthy.